It is BajaCon 2024. It's an amazing event where free thinkers unite, ideas flourish, and we all get a chance to challenge our neurons while making friends and having a whole lot of fun.
Surprise, everybody turns out at 9 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. Hey, it's noon somewhere. And I don't know who thought I was a morning person. This is about 3 hours after my bedtime. Anyway, many years ago, I listened to an interview with, I think he was a bodyguard or a chief of security or something like that for Oral Roberts. And that's the famous televangelist in Tulsa who ran the City of Faith and who once saw a vision of a 900-foot Jesus raise the City of Faith. And he told, 900 feet, by the way, that's big enough to take on Godzilla and Cthulhu. But he told his people that he wanted his congregation to give him $8 million or else God was going to kill him because God is an extortionist. Makes perfect sense. And what does God need the $8 million for? Is he going to feed starving children in some war-torn country? No. God never does anything for those people. God threatened to kill Oral Roberts if Oral Roberts could not raise the money to build his City of Faith project. So God threatened to kill Oral Roberts if his followers didn't give Oral. Just had to check my script. Yeah, it was good. God threatened to kill Oral Roberts if Oral Roberts' followers didn't give Oral Roberts the money that Oral Roberts wanted to build onto Oral Roberts' property. So this isn't about what God wanted. It's all about what Oral Roberts wanted. You know, God didn't have any interest in this at all. Fuck those children.
Can you pull the microphone closer?
I wanted to, but they put it here. Yeah. No. Yeah, I remember college. Okay, so really, it was like if I had said, give me the money that I wanted so that I can do what I want with it, and if you don't give it to me, then I'm going to hold my breath and stamp my feet. And then when it came down to the wire and it looked like they weren't going to make the required amount by the deadline, then there was an announcement that God might barter down. Because God is such a coward when it comes to making a deal. It's Sunday. Where's my money, bitch? Oh, this is all you got? Well, that's fine. I can spot you for the rest. We'll forget. Does that sound like the God of the Bible? That guy's an ass. So it shouldn't matter if God killed Roberts, because he was then 69 years old and he's a servant of God and he's worried that God is going to call him home. Where's the threat there? And most of the people giving this $8 million all live in trailers anyway. Keep your money. Anyway, it wouldn't have mattered if God had killed Oral Roberts, because Roberts was not only a faith healer, he was also a necromancer. Yes. Roberts claimed to have brought a dead baby back to life, to the cheers of his believers, of course, until fact checkers pointed out that no one had actually declared that baby to be dead in the first place. Which kind of ruined the miracle when he had to admit that all he really did was awaken a sleeping baby. We, the parents, thought we would have a moment of rest ourselves, but thanks to you, no, we don't. Not anymore, damn it. So anyway, this security officer, or whatever he was in the interview that I was listening to, explained how he wanted to believe, but that he just couldn't go on faith alone. I mean, he couldn't just make believe whatever he was told to believe simply because he was told to believe it. He had to have a reason, a verifiable fact to justify that belief. And I feel the same way. I mean, there's lots of stuff I want to believe, but no amount of faith will turn a false belief into a fact. Although Jesus seems to have had the opposite opinion. Jesus told his followers that if they just believed hard enough, that they could make fantasy become reality. That if you have enough faith and you're absolutely convinced of your own mystical power, then you could tell that mountain to jump into the sea and it would be in the sea. And there's no reason to believe that, and it goes against all reason, because mountains don't listen. They don't hear you, they don't follow verbal commands, and they can't jump. But what if a mountain could jump into the sea? What if Christians jump, be in the sea, and then the mountain is suddenly in the sea? What happens to the coastal communities on the opposite shore? You know, if Jesus was correct, Christians would be causing tsunamis all over the world. Hebrews 11:1 says that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. That's circular reasoning. That's the question-begging fallacy, which is ubiquitous throughout all religions. You assume you're right because you believe you're right, and you won't ever question whether you're right, nor will you try to find out, because you'll also never admit when you're wrong. That's how faith works. Religious tradition requires faith because religious leaders don't want believers to have or use reason. Remember what Jesus said to his apostle Thomas. He said, "You believe because you've seen the evidence, but blessed is he who has not seen and yet believed." So what's that mean? If you base your belief on evidence, then fuck you. You're not blessed, which means you're not magically enchanted, unless you blindly believe whatever fool thing I said just because I said so. When you were a little kid, did your parents ever say, "Because I said so, that's why"? If that answer wasn't good enough for a child, how is it good enough for an adult? But you have to believe it, and believe it completely, without question, reservation, or reason. Otherwise, you may be accused of blasphemy, heresy, or apostasy, and all of those carried a death sentence when Christianity was in charge, before we secured a secular government where we had free thought and critical inquiry. My state of Texas wants to ban both of those things, by the way, because the point of Abrahamic religion is forced conformity in submission to an erroneously assumed authority, where opposing opinions can be criminalized. I've heard a lot of Christians say that there's science in the Bible, but no, there ain't. Not only is everything the Bible says about science laughably wrong, but the practice of science means questioning your assumptions and then testing them, not to prove them right, because you can't prove it right. That's against the rules. If we did that, then we would be susceptible to confirmation bias, just like religion is. So we do the opposite instead and try to prove our perspective wrong, and then only tentatively accept what we haven't been able to prove wrong, rather than claiming something to be the absolute fact until you can prove it wrong, because that's thinking backwards, which is what religion does. But Jesus says, no, no, no. Thou shalt not put the Lord thy God to the test, because Jesus believed in arguments from authority, wherein alleged authorities cannot be questioned because we assume that they're never wrong, that not even when they fail to deliver on their prophecies and promises. For example, in Mark 11:24, Jesus says, "Whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it and it will be yours." What's he saying? What's he asking you to do? What does it mean to believe that you have received it? He's asking you to pretend. Yeah, pretend that you got whatever you asked for. Then it will be yours, because you ain't getting it otherwise. And that's what faith is all about. Pretending. Sometimes it's pretending as if you know things you don't know. Other times it's pretending you already got what you still ain't got. And that's why I have to keep telling believers in my family to stop reading off their bank information to some scammer on the phone. If you really won the Publishers Sweepstakes Clearinghouse, their website says that they will show up unannounced with a big damn check. Their website says they will not call you in advance to tell you some bullshit like, yeah, well, before you can get your $50,000, you have to pay us $400 on the taxes or a winner's fee or something. That's not how publisher sweepstakes work. That's not how prizes work. That's how scams work. Oh, but then I'm the bad guy because I'm the unbeliever, the infidel who caused the faithful to stumble in a crisis of faith because they thought it was really real. They believed it with their whole heart, so they knew it to be real. And then I ruined it with my lack of faith. I jinxed it. Because if I just believed like they did, then it would still be real. As if it was real when they believed it, and it didn't stop being real until I dispelled the illusion. If I hadn't said anything, if I hadn't walked in when I did to catch them reading off their account numbers, if I didn't know what they were doing, then they would have gotten that money because they believed they received it. And that makes it my fault that she got scammed. So it's my fault that instead of spending her new fortune, we now have to notify her bank to change her accounts, and now we have to report yet another fraud to the FBI because she fell for that shit again. Which brings me back to the security agent in the interview that I was listening to in my car on a road trip somewhere. The guy running Oral Roberts' security detail, if I remember correctly, apparently had some degree of police training, enough that he was inclined to investigate when things seemed suspicious. So here he was, working for one of the most famous faith healers in the world at that time. Oral Roberts had been healing people for decades. So this security officer asked Oral Roberts for one name, one person out of all of those in that congregation that he could look into and see that their medical records or their proud family would verify that this person had been, in a wheelchair or whatever, had some irreversible chronic condition for so many years or whatever, until Oral Roberts laid his hands upon them and they were healed forever after that. That's all he wanted. However, Roberts dodged the question every time it was asked. So the guy kept asking, politely, earnestly and sincerely, until eventually Roberts replied in frustration, "There's a lot of exaggeration in this business." Now, let's ignore for the moment the relevant fact that religion is a business. We'll even ignore this man's testimony wherein Oral Roberts tacitly admitted that he was a fraud, that in his decades-long career as a faith healer, he had never actually healed anyone. Not physically, anyway. At most, you could say that he healed them spiritually, which means that he didn't really heal them, but they want to pretend that he did. They really wish they could pretend that he did. Now, today we're talking about the exaggeration part, which leads to embellishment, both of which are necessary to any account of religious experiences. I've often been told that if I just read the Bible or the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita that I will believe, or that if I ask God to reveal himself to me, then he will, but only if I ask him sincerely with my whole heart. Meaning that if I only want to winnow fact from falsity to better understand whatever is really true rationally, then that means my heart is hardened. And God will not reply under those circumstances. The only way God will reveal himself is if I already have a deep-seated emotional need to believe, such that I might still believe even if it's not really true. I've met several people like that. Even then, when God reveals himself, as believers report, he doesn't appear before you to speak to you like any real person would. Other gods do that. Even lesser gods do that. I know a guy who worshipped the Egyptian cat-headed goddess Bast because, he said, she appeared to him in his house, physically manifest, visible, audible, tangible. She gave him a hug and asked him to become her disciple. And I understand how compelling that could be. I mean, there was this nice young lady that showed up at my door. She was running for state senate. She was there she is in person, standing on my step, asking me to vote for her. I did, and she won, because mine's the only vote that counts. So, just think about it. When a goddess with a cat's head shows up in your house, topless as she is commonly depicted, and asks you to worship her, well, you do. These lesser characters are more approachable, but God, Yehovah, El Allah Abba Yahweh, he's too famous for that. Getting a response from him is like getting a form letter from somebody that has never heard of you. Although the people who keep getting scammed in my family honestly think that they're receiving correspondence from Donald Trump. When you ask the Abrahamic God to reveal himself, that instead of a personal appearance or really any kind of intelligible reply at all, you're expected to imagine the slightest calming effect. A gentle breeze, a ray of sunshine, anything like that, or even anything less than that. Whatever subjective impression or assumption it is, you have to seize on that and exaggerate it out of sheer credulity into God revealing himself through whatever sign you can imagine. Figure out some poetic way to spin it later. You've done the deed, and now you can tell the judge that they don't have to hold you accountable because God has already forgiven you. For a lot of people, becoming a believer is as easy as asking God to reveal himself and then thinking, well, of course God exists because I don't understand things, therefore magic. Of course, you don't describe it like that when you're still a believer. I didn't. Y'all didn't. Many of us tried to believe. Some of us did believe. And we didn't describe our belief that way. Not back then. But if you used to hold a fundamentalist view, a belief in a magical, supernatural creation over evolution or cosmogony, and we have since come to reconsider or ultimately discard that belief, then as we now reflect on our past position, then yeah, that was pretty much belief in magic. The point is that even your own circular assumptions can be exaggerated into God talking to you through your preconceived biases. William Lane Craig argued in his ridiculous book, the oxymoronic title, A Reasonable Faith. He said that when a person refuses to come to Christ, it is never because of a lack of evidence or because of intellectual difficulties, but we willingly ignore and reject the drawing of God's Spirit on our hearts. That's what he says. But not only is that not true of everyone, that's never been true of anyone. Yeah. And it certainly doesn't make sense to the many of us who were once faithful believers. I'm on the board of directors of American Atheist 501c3. Seth and I both are. The vast majority of our membership were once Christian. Some of us were Muslim, and some of us bounced through different faiths before realizing that faith itself is the problem. To my experience with nearly every one of our board members, speakers, activists, and assorted conventioneers, we were not lazy in our faith. We didn't fall from grace by sliding down some slippery slope, certainly not out of our love of sin, whatever the fuck that means. When you talk to Seth, do you get the impression that Seth loves sin? We're not talking about what you might think of me. We're talking about him now. The fact is that many of us were committed believers who didn't just read the scriptures, we studied them more deeply than most Christians, even in the clergy. We didn't just talk the talk, we walked the walk. And look how many of the best advocates for atheism began as professional preachers and missionaries and ministers and seminary students, or like Seth, who was in Christian radio broadcasting for much of his life. As you know, I went another way. I told you all about this when I was here last year. Please forgive the short recap. Yes, I was a reborn Christian once, for a few hours one day in 1981. Until my minister said to just keep telling yourself it's Jesus until you believe it. Because his admission of that faith was just a matter of lying to yourself, that kind of caused my Christianity to die in rebirth. One might even say that I was stillborn in Christ. But for those who think they were born again, how does that work? Well, this wasn't the case for me. I was just doing it because my friends were doing it and I wanted to remain spiritually aligned with them. But I noted in a lot of other cases, If you weren't already raised to be that way, and sometimes even if you were, it usually happens when you're at your lowest point, riddled with guilt and shame and confusion at where it all went wrong. Because you're young and dumb and full of, well, not that, well, maybe that, depending on how naughty you were, but, and in all the wrong places. The point is that your intellect has failed you. Your life isn't working out the way it needs to. You don't know how to fix it. You're desperate. And this is when, as some evangelicals say, that faith has to circumvent the intellect to speak to emotion, the heart. And this is especially true when you're trying to beat an addiction. Religious conversion works in that case because studies have shown that exercising religious belief enhances or produces the same endorphins as a chemical addiction. So you can literally get high on God. And it doesn't matter which God. I think that's significant. In any case, you're literally trading one addiction for another. So at that moment, when many people see no other possible solution and they need one immediately, you utter the incantation, wherein you swear your devotion to your new favorite version of some foreign deity. Whether you declare that there is only one God and Muhammad is his prophet, or that Jesus is your Lord and Savior, or you dedicate your life to Bast or to the pursuit of Krishna consciousness, whatever it is, the moment you say that, especially if you say it in front of witnesses, then that is the moment that you expect to remember as the instant when it all changed. I've since read the testimonies of believers of other faiths talking about that moment, like this woman in Thailand who said that her whole life turned around to the moment that she accepted Buddha into her heart. And the way out of faith is not as fast as the way in. The way in is an incantation, an act of a moment. The way out is more like trying to find your way out of the woods in the dark when you know that you get back to your tent, your campsite, when you know that the campfire's already out. It takes a while. And some of y'all may be embarrassed that you used to believe in a talking snake and a floating zoo and a flood over mountaintops, but at least you have the advantage that millions of other people believed in that too, and a whole lot of them still do, so you can't feel too stupid about it. I, on the other hand, believe things no one else believed, which is why I don't talk about that. These were my own hypotheses on the workings of the supernatural realm. And I don't like to talk about it because I'm frankly embarrassed that I used to be one of those hippies that were all around me, like back in Los Angeles when I grew up as a kid in the 60s and 70s, when everyone was all about heightened levels of mystical spiritualism, dude. As you know, I took the route of neo-pagan spiritualism, or consciousness, which actually began with the study of Eastern religions. Why? Because I was a Beatles fan as a teenager, and I remember George Harrison using the argument that if there's a God, I want to see him. It's pointless to believe in something without proof, and Krishna consciousness and meditation are methods where you can actually obtain God perception. And that way you can see, hear, and play with God. Perhaps this may sound weird, but God is really there, next to you. And remember that when he says God, he's talking about Sri Krishna. So I resolved that I wouldn't take Harrison's word for it, even though he was my favorite Beatle. Instead, I would do pretty much as he did and find out for myself by seeking to experience the supernatural firsthand. And just remember that back then, it seemed as if everyone believed in something supernatural. Even Gene Roddenberry, who was an atheist who wrote Star Trek, even he believed in telepathy and telekinesis, remote viewing, psychic empathy, and all of that, because a lot of us thought that there was scientific evidence for this shit back then, back before the internet, when you could just look up everything right now, and know better. We thought that parapsychology was a thing. We thought that they were actual people with PhD degrees that had bottle or jars of ectoplasm in their evidence shelves. Yeah. And my approach was to explore transcendental meditation and other occult practices in an attempt to see for myself whether there was any truth to this and what it might be, as I still thought there was some truth to all this. And I know I told you all this last year, but part of that is relevant now too. So how does the practice of New Age spiritualism work? Well, let's say that you're just trying to read someone's aura. That's pretty basic. What is an aura? Well, there's this pretty lady named Teal Swan who is quite a popular New Age spiritualist with a couple million subscribers on her YouTube channel, which I guess makes her the leading authority on this in lieu of any experts in this field at all. And she says that auras are essentially a field of subtle, luminous electromagnetic radiation surrounding a physical thing. At this point, it is important to note that this alleged electromagnetic radiation cannot be measured in wavelengths, frequencies, amps, ohms, volts, watts, rads, candle power, nor by any other means known to man. They can't be imaged by any device, not even the ones that can see into the broader spectrum of invisible light from infrared to ultraviolet. All these devices can do is detect gamma rays and radio waves, things that are produced by physical photons. No, this type of electromagnetic radiation is neither electrical nor magnetic. It is allegedly extra-dimensional and therefore consequently immeasurable by any physical device. This radiation is a spectral manifestation that can only be detected spiritually by a psychic using extrasensory perception. What does extrasensory perception mean? It's when you train yourself to disassociate from your physical dimension, to open your third eye chakra of psychic awareness of the multiple overlapping dimensions vibrating at non-physical frequencies or resonance. Dude. Teal Swan is kind of amazing because she can talk for quite a while with absolute confidence and unrivaled authority without ever saying anything that is either verifiable or falsifiable. There's no way she's right. Absolutely no data supports what she's saying at all, but at the same time, there's no way to prove her wrong either. And that's why the burden of proof has to be on the one making the positive claim. Show me the truth to it or admit there is no truth to it. As some primitive traditions believe that everything has a spirit, even rocks. And likewise, Teal Swan believed that all things have an aura. I, however, was under the impression that the only living things could generate an aura. And the way I understood it was this immeasurable energy was a force created by all living things, just like Obi-Wan Kenobi said. Because an aura is the energy emanating from a spiritual being, which also transmits information, which again, only a psychic can see or understand because the information is spiritual, not physical, not real. Yeah, if you don't want to trust the psychic blindly, the only thing you can do is look at the aura yourself. So how do you do that? Well, let's see. The easiest way, if you want to use your physical eyes, is to have your subject stand about 6 or more feet away, ideally against a blank white background. And then you can use other avenues of perception beyond sight. Perhaps you could stretch out your feelings. Close your eyes and then visualize what shape or color the aura is. Use your third eye, the one in the middle of your forehead, the one you imagine, the one that isn't really there. But if you're a beginner, like I was, having to rely on vision, then pick a focal point. Maybe stare into their third eye chakra. And then relax your gaze. While you keep your physical eyes where they are and move your mind's eye to the periphery. And as your eyes tire of focusing on what you're not looking at, you'll begin to see a fuzzy haze around the borders of their physical being, different shapes and colors. And that is what the aura is. You're starting to see into the aural spectrum, the auric field surrounding your subject, which is barely perceptible against the white of the wall. And the longer you stare, the more weary your eyes become, the more you'll notice colored fields and shapes against that white wall surrounding and overlapping your subject. And the more you practice this, the more adept or susceptible you'll become at perceiving or imagining different dimensions of this energetic fields that can't be measured in any of the ways that we measure or recognize energy. The problem with that is multifaceted. First of all, we know that if you stare at anything like that long enough, you will eventually see color distortions in the periphery, regardless whether there's an undetectable energy there or not. And then, not even string theory allows for the kind of overlapping dimensions that these spiritualists are talking about. So there's no actual factual evidence for it and no way to adequately test it, nor is there any way to falsify it, even with multiple observers, because if two people focus on the same subject at the same time and see different colored auras representing opposing vibrations, both of them are told that that's no problem because the differences in perception are due to the level of aptitudes in each of the psychics involved. As if they're both perceiving the same subject but at different depths. Thus, even entirely different and violently conflicting interpretations can both be considered correct, even when they're apparently just doing cold readings like any other fake psychic would. That's ultimately why I became frustrated with my own exploration of spiritualism. There was never anything measurable or testable or reliably consistent, nothing to confirm that there was ever a there. There was no truth to any of it, meaning nothing we could objectively show to be true. So let's get away from psychics for a moment and look at prophets, which are basically the same thing. Does anybody remember what was supposed to happen on May 21st, 2011? That was the day that Christian radio show host Harold Camping said that there's going to be a terrific earthquake, way bigger than anything the earth has ever experienced, and that will be the beginning of Judgment Day. It was supposed to be that at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, the earth would crack open, killing millions of people and flinging corpses out of their graves directly into heaven. Some of Camping's followers were so upset by this that they took extreme measures. One woman murdered her children to save them from Satan. How that works, I don't know. Another elderly gentleman spent his entire life savings on billboards advertising the coming doomsday. And there's this hilarious photo of him at Times Square. He's looking at his watch, confused, because it's 6:02 and nothing's happened, and there's this huge crowd around him, and they're all laughing their asses off as this senior citizen is now penniless in his declining years. Because as every unbeliever accurately predicted, the apocalypse never came. But importantly, Harold Camping's ledger was leaked to the internet. And it showed that before the end of the world, he was already scheduling appointments for after the end of the world. For donations and business meetings and things like that. So he knew it wasn't going to happen. So he's predicting something he knows is not going to happen, and he's ruining people's lives over it. Absolutely no moral compunction at all. He just lied to his listeners and gave them something fun to pretend while they ruin their lives in response. And the more important message here is that when Harold Camping was confronted about why his prophecy has failed, he argued that no, it happened. All of that happened. It just happened spiritually. The most dramatic earthquake, the greatest earthquake in geological history, happened spiritually, so that nobody felt it. Killing millions of people spiritually, which I guess is correct because a lot of people's spirituality died that day. So let's look at another example. In 2014, American atheists held their national convention in Salt Lake City, Utah. And there were some Christian protesters outside predicting the end, not of the whole world necessarily, but at least of the U.S. economy. There were a number of protesters who told me that this would happen as a result of the fourth blood moon tetrad that was supposed to occur on September 23rd, 2015. And there were several people across the internet who predicted the end of human civilization at the hands of a comet that was supposed to hit on that day. But this particular guy said that only the U.S. economy would collapse, such that the dollar would become worthless. And to be more specific, because I pressed him on this, I want to know how we're going to falsify this prediction, because the one thing prophecies do is fail. You just have to see how. So he told me that on that day, if his prophecy is fulfilled, then it will not be possible for us to walk into a restaurant and buy dinner, because there won't be any value to the dollar. There just won't be any economy going at all. So I got him to agree on camera that on or after that day, that if his prophecy failed, then he has to buy me dinner He offered to buy me dinner if it fails. But I asked for one more thing. I want him to admit that he was wrong and all that that implies. However, on September 29th of that year, 18 months later, I posted a video calling him out and messaged him directly about that. I gave him my PayPal address and told him that was a cheap date. He only owed me $25 for dinner, but I was more interested in his admission that he was wrong, an acknowledgement that his prophecy had failed, that it did not come true. He replied, but did not keep his word. Can you imagine what he told me? Instead, he said that what he predicted actually came true, exactly as he said, but that it only happened spiritually. Which I now have to interpret as meaning that it didn't happen in reality. It only happened as in his imagination. Thus, I am now of the opinion that faith and spirituality is not even connected with reality, that is entirely a product of the imagination, and that's the Christian faith and the faith of neo-pagans, even my own when I was either of those things, and it also of my friend who worships Bast. Because I'm beginning to suspect the remote possibility that perhaps a bare-breasted babe with the head of a talking cat might not have actually teleported into his living room. No, I'm beginning to think that particular ancient Egyptian deity appeared to him only spiritually. Although knowing this guy, to be fair, there's also the possibility she may have appeared to him chemically. Maybe even pathologically. And this brings us up to the thing that I wanted to talk to you about, the single most insane argument for God that I have ever heard. And that's saying something, because I've been arguing with believers almost every day for a quarter century, since before Y2K. So buckle up for this one. We are told that in 1917, 3 Portuguese children, shepherds, because they don't go to school, had a vision of the Virgin Mary. Well, really, it was just the 10-year-old girl who saw or spoke to the apparition. The younger siblings were just there to smile and nod and say, yeah, whatever, and go along with it. The story is that the Lady of the Rosary told this kid a handful of prophecies, all of them saying, well, if this happens, then this other thing will be the likely result, which isn't really a prophecy, is it? Because that's the Virgin Mary tacitly admitting that she doesn't know whether this or that will happen. And the one significant prediction mentioned that Russia might become an atheist state. And to be fair, this was before the Soviet Union had adopted that policy. But then I remember our Senator Newt Gingrich when he said that Muslims were atheists who worship the devil. And Protestants often say that Catholics aren't really Christians but pagans, and ancient pagans invented the word atheist to describe early Christians. So it's actually common for believers of one religion to say that another religion is godless, especially in a case like this when we're contrasting Portuguese Catholics with Russian Orthodox. Those two had already been at war a couple of times. Fun fact, Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, the historic Dracula, fought on both sides of that war. Just interesting factoid. Anyway, these 3 kids were allegedly instructed that God would perform a miracle on October 13th of that year, right in their little field. And why was God going to do that? So that more people would believe. So God is going to produce a public spectacle miracle. Invite all your friends. God's going to show up and do something. What? We don't know. God is entirely too vague. So vague that his prophecies don't even count as prophecies. But if that was the motive to get more people to believe, then I have to wonder, why is it that God will only give a private audience and then only to the least credible people for miles around? Usually folks that can't even read. Then he trusts these questionable incompetents to spread his message in a game of telephone, and always with no evidence whatsoever, which never works out right. It always only ever leads to greater conflicts and confusion with whole new religions to pop up, go to war with. But Mr. Infallible Omniscience still hasn't recognized the pattern of perpetual failure and will not correct it either. He keeps doing the same thing, expecting different results, which either means that God is insane, or the people who think they're talking for him are insane, because it really seems like God is not actually there, and that these ignorant but imaginative make-believers are just wittingly or unwittingly making shit up. The newspapers got a hold of the story and promoted it so that on that day, somewhere between 30,000 to as many as 70,000 people showed up in this field to see the promised miracle, whatever that was supposed to be. And remember that this was Western Europe a century ago. Not only were many of these poor farmers and sheep herders undereducated and extremely religious Catholics, they were also emotionally distraught, believing that the end of time, the end of the world was nigh, like every generation always thinks it is. But this was during the First World War, which was an unprecedented escalation of mechanized mayhem. So these people were much more sure of their looming doom. They had no idea that only a generation later that their situation would somehow get exponentially worse, or more importantly, that the trend would then suddenly reverse, going from the worst ever to the best ever and keep getting better for a lifetime after that. For whatever reason, Lady Madonna failed to deliver either of those prophecies, both of which would have been better than what the little girl had reported. So the only thing the people knew was that shit is getting bad, being already the most frightening times their country had ever seen. World War I was worse than the Spanish Inquisition. No one expected that. I hear the groans. You people are nerds. I love it. These poor, pathetic people were deeply superstitious and scared out of their wits, whatever wits they still had, because whatever wits their faith left them. Because, as you know, devout fundamentalists are not exactly known for their intellectual aptitude, nor for their command of logic. Instead, they are passionately irrational. They were promised a miracle, and they desperately needed to see one. As the mob grew impatient, the Madonna appeared. Now there's a fucking miracle. A spectral apparition of the Virgin Mother appears before an audience of tens of thousands of people, just like the real Madonna, by which I mean the material girl. Oh, except that the Virgin Mary could only be seen or heard by that one 10-year-old girl and nobody else. Talk about a missed opportunity for a memorable and meaningful miracle. Mary could have spoken to the masses herself. God could have spoken to them. Or God could have sent his son, Don Jr. He'd have to call himself Jesus, and he'd have to speak Portuguese, but he could have floated over the ground, illuminated like he so often is, and give a speech of encouragement in these troubled times. But as we mentioned, only the lesser gods do that. The really famous ones won't even sign an autograph or take a selfie. Now, once again, instead of God's word, all you're going to get is some vague interpretation of whatever you imagine to be a sign. Now, it was at this point, the only, or up to this point, the only miracle is that all these people ever listened to such wild claims from a little girl in the first place, from a little kid. Where is our promised miracle? The mob demanded. And it was in that moment that the sun shone through the clouds, because it had been raining heavily all morning. And then the little girl said, "Look at the sun." And they did. They stared directly into the naked sun like idiots, ready for the promised miracle, wanting it, needing to see it, waiting for it until some of them, not all of them, but some of them reported seeing the sun begin to do strange things. Some of the massive mob said that as they stared into the sun, it appeared to get dimmer than normal. Like what happens when you look at a welding torch. The middle of it goes dim because of damage to the retina. Some also reported that the sun seemed to change colors, which again is another effect of staring into a bright light. And if they stared long enough, some even reported that the sun seemed to roll around rapidly, spinning on an axis. As our day star continued to burn into their gaping retinas, some folks even noticed that it seemed to dance from one place to another. You stare at the sun for a while, you look over there, and it's over there! And it's over there! How the hell is that happening? You ever do it? We all did this as kids, right? The difference is that these people are diehard believers. They are devout. They're desperate and devout. And they are now bolstered by the fact that there are tens of thousands of them, and they all need to see a miracle. They're desperate to see this miracle. And if you want to know what the miracle is that they saw, just go outside right now and stare into the sun like a bunch of morons. Because that's what every fool sees when they stare directly into the sun. And I've noticed that when you're in these moments, when you're completely psyched up, to see your favorite Hindu god, your favorite Egyptian god, or just to see an aura, that if you're really looking for a miracle, you're probably going to see it, whether it's there or not. I had somehow never heard of this really famous miracle before last month, and the guy that told me about it accused me of being a fool for not immediately believing impossible nonsense for no good reason. I'm a little confused as to how they define the word fool. And why was I, he told me that I should read the testimonies of those who saw the sun dancing in the sky and to ignore all those other witnesses who were there and said, no, the sun never did a damn thing. I don't know what the hell the rest of these people are talking about. In fact, one testimony that he recommended was a guy who said that the sun came down through the clouds and that it hovered about the treetops for a moment or so before zooming back up into the sky. And he wasn't the only one, because a handful of other people also said that the sun came down to the earth. So I pressed this guy, who was emailing me all this bullshit and criticizing me, telling me how stupid atheists are for not believing this. And I eventually got him to clarify that he's not a flat earther or a geocentrist. He accepts that the sun is the center of the solar system and that the Earth and all the other planets orbit around it because the sun is bigger than all the other planets, than the Earth and all of the other planets combined. And this is where the reasoning started to get weird. He was so impressed that God had the power to make the sun dance and spin around in the sky, so God would have the power to neutralize the heat so that it doesn't hurt us either. Like, the sun didn't fucking move. I asked him, how is it that the only people to see any of this were just some of the crowd that were in the vicinity of Fatima, Portugal, and not anyone else, anywhere else, over the rest of the world? Because this reportedly happened at noon in Portugal. So it should have been visible all over Europe, all over Africa, and Brazil, and Cuba, and the Northern American eastern seaboard, and all the way as far east as India. But hundreds of millions of people never saw shit. Just a reported few thousand in a field in Portugal. His explanation was that the vision was the miracle, that it was a personal revelation from God, and that you had to have faith in order to see it. And he said that God chooses who will see it and who won't. I said, but if you have to have faith to see it, then God failed in his attempt to get more people to believe. And by your own admission, if you have to have faith to see it, then they're having to imagine what is obviously not really happening, because it's not like the whole rest of the world needed faith to see the sun stay in its place and behave like it always does on any other day. But he still argued that no, it's real, that the sun came down to the earth just like these flat earth believers thought. So I pressed him again and asked if the sun moved for thousands who had faith enough to see it move, then did it also simultaneously remain still for the hundreds of millions of people who saw it stand still? He was still undeterred, so he hit him with this. If the earth is represented as a single drop of water, then the sun is a basketball 25 meters away. It would take 8 minutes for the sun to get to the earth at the speed of light. And minutes before it got here, you already wouldn't be able to see it in the sky. The whole sky would be the sun. You wouldn't be able to see the circle of the sun because it's so much bigger than the earth. It hasn't even gotten here yet. The whole sky is the sun. Could a basketball come down to a drop of water? If that had happened, the sun would engulf the earth in its gravity, to say nothing of its heat. In fact, the whole solar system would be destroyed if the sun suddenly left its place in the center at warp speed, like he's talking about. Nor would it be possible for the sun to dance by moving over here to over here, over here, because that would require light speed travel too, and a hell of a lot of mass to accelerate and brake instantly in any direction. The sun is more than 100 times the diameter of the earth, so how is an 865,000 mile wide sun going to fit into 1 mile space between the earth and the clouds? And finally, there's no need for any of this nonsense. If God could do all that, he could do anything, but there's no need to break all the laws of physics and logic and destroy the solar system all at the same time. If nothing is impossible for God, then just have him say hi. How is all of this astral spectacle easier and better for God than simply introducing himself? And finally, I got this guy to backtrack and concede that all these people saw a ball of light moving in the sky, whether it was the sun or not, though he still said that was a miracle. And then I pointed out that this wasn't a one-time occurrence like he said it was. It's been happening regularly in the town of Youre, Bosnia since 1981. Catholic pilgrims come here from all over the world to see the sun spin in the sky. Again, you have to have faith to see it, which proves that cameras are atheists. Because no one can capture this movement on their cell phones. Nor do any of these collective idiots realize that this is the same sun in Bosnia that they'd be looking at in Italy or Korea or wherever they're from. If it's spinning here, it's spinning there. It's not a different sun. All of which reminds me of my favorite line out of that movie, Team America, World Police, where a marionette of Kim Jong-il says, "Why is everyone so fucking stupid?" Eventually, after much back and forth in email, I got this guy to concede that the sun obviously really didn't do all of that stuff that would still be physically impossible even for God. And with that said, we can agree that if you have faith enough to see it, then the sun moves. Well, not really, only spiritually. Thank you. Thank you.
The miracle was coming, and it was going. Somebody was going to get it, or it was going to go on by. This is a big moment. And this blind man sitting there expecting a miracle, he believed it would come to him someday, recognized it when it approached, and he reached out to get it.
Why is everyone so fucking stupid?